So, Harris, you've got a background in economics, you've got a background in banking, you're now running a social care enterprise. What do you think that families most misunderstand about social care from an economic and funding perspective?
I think very often when I'm talking to people, what surprises me how little they know about the care system in the UK. Very often, people will come in to assess our home as one of the many that they are looking at, and their assumption is that the NHS pays for social care. And if it had happened once or twice, I'd say, okay, it's an anomaly. But it's almost every time people come in and they think the NHS is going to cover social care because it covers healthcare. Very often people struggle to understand, and this is a particular bugbear of mine, from a consumer perspective, people struggle to understand why care delivery is so different when someone has cancer versus when someone has dementia. And it's a bit of a juggle to try and help them understand that that's how funding has been decided to be split by the demigods that rule our country. The successive demigods that have ruled our country. So yeah, very often that's the key one. People will come in from an economic standpoint. They do not understand who is paying for care. Very often they don't know the thresholds that the government has on when someone has to pay for their own care. And I find that lack of education is quite inappropriate given the demographics that we're dealing with, frankly. I think we have to figure out, both as a sector and the government, we have to figure out how we make this a very talked about subject. In fact, I think it should be part of every political party's manifesto to discuss this. To be fair, it is part of every political party's manifesto. They just tend not to do anything about it. But I think it needs to be elevated to a much higher discourse. And it needs to be talked about on the doorstep by politicians and councillors when they're getting elected. It's so important.
Yeah,
Sorry, that was a bit long-winded, but
no,
yeah.
there's tons to unpick, and it's just echoing your point around the importance of social care or people's understanding. It was brought home to me the other day that if we just focus on older people care home beds, so excluding learning difficulty, excluding children, excluding the myriad other different forms of social care out there, there are roughly 400,000 older person social care beds in England. There are 104,000 NHS beds, and there are 90,000 prison cells, prison beds. So just the older person care home part of social care is twice the size of our prison service and NHS combined. And yet
Yeah.
it doesn't receive anywhere near that level of interest from during political cycles.
Yeah, it's I spend what feels like most of my time screaming from the rooftops about this. I think there's lots of stats out there, but the basic ones are, as you've mentioned, we have a large need, and extremely large need. Most Western European countries have the same issue. And I know this is a topic that you love, about demographics and where we are with regards to replacing our own populations. And I think that the amount of attention paid to it is minuscule. I would put this very far up the agenda, similar to another topic that people want to shove their head in the sand about, which is climate change. I think this is one of those. And so, how we get it up the agenda of political parties is the key that I think that the sector needs to work on, come together and really force the discourse that is required for the issue to get resolved. We have contributed as a sector about 77 billion, I think that was the latest report, to the GDP, which is far greater than the car industry. Right? And yet, so you've talked about it from a provision point of view, and I'm talking about it from an economic point of view. We are a far greater contributor to the economy than Jaguar Land Rover. But when Jaguar has a data leak, the government steps in, and that's a tiny part of the automotive sector. And here is an entire sector that's talking about the need for it to become sustainable, and the government's just playing fast and loose. I must correct myself. All governments have played fast and loose in the last 15 years. So I don't want to just be critiquing the current government. You know, short-term policy making for long-term problems has never worked. Yeah.
So, and without diving too much into the technical economics, although I'm sure we could. Just going back to your point about Jaguar Land Rover, we're doing this podcast in November of 25, where the GDP figures came out, and because of this data breach of JLR, UK GDP was downgraded. Yet,
yes.
So you have this manufacturing beast that, because it's making stuff, it's always deemed to have this greater impact on productivity, which is this, we have this low productivity nation in the UK, apparently. There are theories within economics, and I'm talking about Bormel's cost disease and other, where more labour-intensive sectors, like care, like the education, like arts, you have this really high labour cost, and you can't increase productivity that easily. An artist can only produce art at a certain pace, but wages have to. And so you have this linkage between the quality and safety in care and the time presence and attention of the care provider. It's very difficult to provide care faster. It's very difficult to automate the provision of care. I was just wondering what your thoughts are on where we are now in social care, in terms of how we square this circle and how we try and find a way of either making care more productive, or we move to a model where actually the productivity in care is deemed as irrelevant.
I think it's not irrelevant. I think it's relevant. It's very relevant, because it's always relevant. Otherwise, you just continue to have wage inflation, which is sort of what we've had, right? We've had wage inflation for the last 10 years. Was it George Osborne that started it? Mm-hmm. And we've not had an increase in productivity, which has meant that it's just transferred into pure inflation for the economy. Some people would disagree with that, obviously, but I fundamentally believe that you cannot change people's living standards just by increasing their wages. You have to go through the whole cycle. You can't just pick and choose economic concepts and use them as sound bites to get reelected, right? Which is what's been happening. So I think productivity is crucial. I think we've done a great job as a sector. When was the whole digitalization launched? I think 2019, 2020. Mm-hmm. We now have, 75 or 80%, I read the other day, care homes that are using some sort of care management tool, which is cloud-based and not on-prem solutions. And I think that's phenomenal for a sector that's so vast in terms of the number of providers it's got and the type of providers it's got. In fact, I was thinking about this a couple of days ago. I think I can talk about it, but when Four Seasons was selling most of its assets, I went and had a look at a few of them. And now this is a large company. It's was backed by large private equity funds. And you would imagine that that's the type of endeavor that would be able to enact massive technological changes fairly quickly because they've got so many people in middle management and project managers, what have you, to manage these challenging things and make them happen. They don't. They do their rotas by hand, or at least the sites that I went to see, they were still doing their rotas by hand. Care plans, a lot of the care plans were still on paper. So it's in fact the smaller providers who are much more nimble and much more willing to extract that productivity, make the investment, and then innovate. And so the key link, economically speaking, between standard of living and productivity is ultimately that you can increase people's standard of living by increasing real living wage, but real living wage cannot be increased unless you have increased productivity. Increased productivity cannot be had unless innovation is readily, freely, and cheaply available. And so I think, extending that thesis to our sector, we could possibly say, anecdotally, that actually in our sector, it's the small player that needs that support to be able to adapt itself, because it's always quicker, right? It's the same theory as a startup. Startups are, why do people invest in startups? Why do people want to buy things that are produced by startups? Because they're much quicker at testing, learning, changing, adapting, and coming up with a product that works a lot better for the market, right? Free market economics. So, that's why it's so important to support the SME element inside the care sector, I think, rather than this kind of let's sit on the sidelines and see how it all plays out, which is what I suspect the current government is doing. And the reason I mention this is because we now have the FPA, which is the, what does that stand for? There's so many acronyms. God.
Fair pay agreement.
Fair pay agreement, which allows for, an element of unionization for our employees and asks for a higher amount of salary as minimum for carers. And I agree with that in principle. The reality is that that's a little bit more wage inflation without the need to be more productive for the workforce, which then just ultimately results in more inflation. And so the missing element there is this innovation. Now, a lot of government paper has come out. I've read the fair pay agreement that's open for consultation right now. And the bit where we talk about productivity is not detailed enough. In fact, I can go so far as to say there's not a lot of depth. Everything seems to end with but AI. And, it's one of those, I think, not quite as bad as an ostrich hiding its head in the sand, but it's not far from, hiding and avoiding and not taking the challenge head on, which is what we did as a sector right after COVID, when we knew that we would not be able to visit our own sites. And so we had to have the ability to monitor what was happening on site from a distance. Everybody understood that. And then everybody made whatever sacrifice from a margin perspective they had to actually get up to speed. So many small providers are now using the big 2 or the big 5 care management systems in the country. And you sense this real urgency and energy from all of them wanting to pick this up more and more. We now use all of our EMARs, our MARs are all electronic, and they integrate with our care management system. And, these are things that I'd done and heard about in my previous careers, but how quickly we've sort of latched on to the innovative end of it is phenomenal. And I think the key now for small providers is how do you reuse that time that you are saving from innovation? how do you best deploy your staff to make them more productive? And that productivity has, to me, reflect in more positive outcomes for the people that we are actually looking after. And I think that that's where we lost an entire decade to that. So we got new regulation, rightly so. People were trying to understand and get their head around the regulation. And, a lot of people converted into, checklist kings and queens where, everything had a checklist and it had to be checked off, and you had to do the check of the person that was doing the check. And then somebody else had to come externally and come and do the check of the person that was doing the check of the person that was doing the check, and so on and so forth. But ultimately, what that means is that the resident gets forgotten. Because you cannot physically have enough people to do all of the checking. And so we need to find a balance where we are increasing coming back to the original point, where we are increasing the standard of living for the people that provide the service. But we are very aware of the impact that innovation can have, and therefore must ensure that the small provider where the innovation is faster, it's implemented quicker, it's adopted quicker, is made economically easier for them to do. And that's a very long-winded way of saying we must definitely have fair pay for carers, right? You and I both talked about this multiple times. I've talked to so many people, and as I'm sure you have. Everybody agrees. I do not want my carers to be anywhere near minimum wage. I see what they do every day. It's not the same as stacking shelves in a shop. It's dramatically different, and so they ought to be paid more. We understand that, but you can't have fair pay for staff and not fair pay for care provision, right? We need to have fair pay for the small business owner who is also usually, an employee in his own business. Most people in the sector are employees in their own business. So you can think about fair pay for the person that's working the floor, but what about fair pay for the person that's taken all the risk and has set up a business to provide care provision? And so you've got this, multi-pronged approach, but one of the sort of assets that you've got in the system, which is the actual care provider, you're ignoring. You're like, no, that's a business owner. Business is bad. Profit is bad. These guys are all raking it in, so we don't care about those guys. Let's just focus on the guys that are actually delivering the care. Well, it won't work, because while you're incentivizing people to work in the care sector, you're actively disincentivizing people to become providers in the care sector. So while you solve one problem, you are creating another massive one, right? And that's why you and I both have talked about this as well. We've seen loads of small care homeowners selling care homes. You cannot really run a care home now if it's only got 15 beds. It's impossible. The unit economics don't work. It just does not work. And that's such a shame, because these are hyper-localized businesses. And so, I'm reminded of what happened to the corner shop, and then people bemoaned what happened to the high street. Well, this is exactly that. We are repeating it and not caring like we did the last time. So I love a good Pret, by the way. I love Pret sandwiches, but a Pret, sometimes two Prets within 500 meters of each other, in a small town where there should be a lot more independent coffee shops, is insane. So, nobody's a winner in that scenario.
Yeah. So it's really interesting. So going back to the point around productivity and AI. And AI clearly can't automate the more human emotions that we're looking for in care, the empathy, the trust, the companionship. At least not yet. We don't have robots sitting next to the people that we're caring for and providing that care. And essentially we are, what I think what you're talking about there is you've got these larger corporations, the Barchesters, HC1s of this world, and we'll come on to them in a bit more detail, I guess, and recent transaction for them, having these very large 80, even 100-bed care facilities for the older person. And they're operating in a certain model. And then we have the more nimble, smaller providers who we're trying to automate and find time for our staff to provide more attention, that increased human presence. And in many respects, we're also trying to make sure that we've got a fee structure that allows us to do that, because the more fees we have, the more staff we can have on the floor, the more of that care, frankly, that we can provide. But it sounds like you're talking to two very different models. And actually, if you go to the large corporate, particularly where you have a large amount of debt or private equity or other funding structures, that mean your cash flow is going to be spent on servicing that debt, you don't have the degrees of freedom to be nimble, to try new things, to free up that extra hour or two a day. Because in the larger corporates, an hour or two a day doesn't tip the needle. In a smaller provider, actually, that might be an incredibly valuable 15, 20 minutes that we can free up from somewhere. So is that what you're referring to? This sort of this almost.
No, I would say my take is slightly different there, Mike, because I'm actually saying that large providers have got cash available. They definitely do, and that's the bit that the sector unfortunately is measured on, right? So we always have the public disclosure of the large transactions, and everybody sees the margins that those guys are making, and then everybody just assumes that the care home around the corner that's been run by a husband and wife team who grew up in that town or moved from somewhere to start that business, et cetera, they're all the same. But obviously that's not true. My point was, in fact, that large providers, by virtue of being very, very large, need to do everything using a corporate structure, a governance structure, which means that individualism and independence is anathema to them. So they cannot allow for different care homes to operate different policies, for example. How can you manage 200 care homes under the same brand that are all running their own policies? You can't. And so everything has to be uniform, which means that you cannot be nimble anymore. If you're going to do a project where all staff files are now going to be kept in the cloud rather than on location, that's a massive job. When you have 8,000 employees or 10,000 employees, that's not something that happens, in a week. Whereas I did my 4 care homes in 4 weeks, a home a week. That was the target. Just went around, scanned everything, stuck it on the cloud and said, don't make any physical files. That was it. Done. And so now everything's, and then we have our software. I'm going to give them a shout out, Workforce. Very good software, and they've been building their HR side of things quite quickly. And so now we send out all onboarding, contractual information via the app that we've got. And so our staff input their own details. It's these little things, right? When you are a low margin business, in this barbelling that I was talking about, these guys are actually high margin business. The big ones are in fact high margin businesses. So the need to change is low. And the added complexity being so large, everything has to be exactly the same. So the project size becomes massive, sometimes too massive to manage. So they just don't do it. Ours is a situation where the margins are so thin, even that 50 bips extra that you could, perhaps gain from investing a little bit of time, a little bit of money into innovation or into adopting a new technology, you will definitely look at that. And so that's why the small business actually needs support, because this is where a lot of the software providers will enter into the market. So it's not just that it's, the small provider at this end need support because otherwise they can't innovate properly. And if they can't innovate, they will die because the margin is too small. It's actually, we have generated so much desire for people to enter into the software market that is focused entirely on care. I don't know when it was the last time that you went to the care show, but the first time I went was 7 years ago. I didn't even own a care home at that point. And it was much smaller than it was just now in Birmingham. It's vastly different scale in the last 7 years. There are so many different new companies that have come into the sector because, you know, people like you and I are buying this stuff. We are crying out for innovation and we're ready to adopt it because it's so much more visceral for us, right? 50 bips, 100 bips savings, I'm on it all day, every day. I want that. Barchester, what's that going to do? Not much. I think there's that. That's what I meant, actually.
Okay. I think going back to your point, you were the very first point you made around people's understanding of the funding. I think you're completely right.
Yeah.
By the way, people don't understand how social care is funded, but I think people will be really interested to understand why you can have different margins in a care home, because clearly a care home is a care home is a care home is a care home. Why are the larger providers, why are you defining them as high margin, whereas you've got organisations such as yourself and you'd be defining yourself as low margin? Can you just explain why you feel that there are those two different parts of the sector?
Well, I think some of the large providers, not all of them, but some of the very large providers are doggedly pursuing the private-only segment of the market, and actively they are not providing beds for the local authority-funded residents. And I think that basically means that they are not price takers, but price givers. And so effectively they set their private rates. If you can pay those rates, you're welcome to use their facilities. If you cannot pay those rates, you are not allowed in. Very often, they are able to move residents on once their private funding runs out. They fall below the threshold, and they are then going to be funded by the local authority. The rate difference now on average, I can't remember what it is. I think it's about 250 or 300 pounds a week. Across England, and then in the different local authorities it can be more, and so it has a meaningful impact on their profit and loss, and so they stick very closely to whatever ratios they've got of local authority versus private funded for that particular location. And if those ratios don't work, they actively move people on to other locally funded care homes. The problem with all of this is that while their margin is maintained and it creates inbound demand for smaller providers or local providers who service mostly local authority residents, moving for a resident who is very often too frail to move is never a positive experience. And so what a lot of smaller providers tend to do, because the owners are directly involved in the provision of service, I make those decisions in my business, for example. I very often say, no, we're not going to move someone. So that's the starting point. We do negotiate with local authorities because we cannot afford to have our margins impeded like that. But it's always with the proviso that this person is not going to leave here. We are going to do whatever we possibly can to ensure that we come to an agreement where local authority budget, care home constraint, and resident well-being, all three of them are satisfied in as much as those can be satisfied. And so that's our starting point, whereas theirs is, all right, fallen below, here's the private fee. Can you pay it for this resident? If not, please find another location in 28 days.
Why do you think that the larger groups are so hyper focused on this private pay part of the sector?
I think, I don't think, I mean, I'm pretty convinced it's to do with the need for the private sector to fund the developments that they are currently undertaking. And the cost of development has gone up quite dramatically since the start of the Ukraine war. There's loads of projects that were launched and, kind of half completed, and the price shot up. And so they are now trapped, and they must make those projects work. When you back solve some of those projects now for the new increased cost, the only way to help those projects survive and indeed service the funding costs that you were talking about earlier is to have, a base rate, a weekly fee of £1,800 to £2,000 per week. And so they have no choice. And they've undertaken these very ambitious builds. It is challenging for me to say that that's the wrong strategy, primarily because in the long term, to have a sustainable sector, we all have to make sure that the housing that we have got is actually appropriate for the service that we are providing. You and I have to spend a lot of money on our converted properties to keep pace with the requirements for the residents that we're looking after. And so we do need someone with deeper pockets to come in and build these new facilities so that in 5, 10 years' time, 20 years' time, some of the ones that have not been invested in can be replaced eventually. It depends on who you talk to. If you talk to somebody who's in the building trade, they will come and tell you, oh my God, 70% of the properties that are currently in use are actually inappropriate for the service. And you could say that writ large for all housing in the UK, in fact, right? And so what it comes down to, again, it's going to sound like a broken record, is, having the fair cost of care being paid to the provider so that the provider can then reinvest in the properties that they are currently providing these services in. When we did the fair cost of care exercise, what was it, 4 years ago? Part of that was a return of capital on the building itself. To have a sustainable sector, you cannot assume that you're going to build fast enough to replace and therefore make defunct all of the other properties that are currently providing the services. That will be foolhardy. We've already seen, successive government fail to meet housing targets that they've set themselves. And, it's just not that easy with planning laws and what have you, all the hurdles that we've got to get to just replacing the beds we have, never mind the increased demand that we're going to have, which, some people have estimated as 140,000 new beds. So by what, 10 years, 15 years time, it's 15 years from now, we need 140,000 new beds in addition to the 450 you mentioned earlier in the call. So I think it would be pretty dumb to suggest that, I could keep saying Barchester, but, the top 15 big brands should not be building these fancy properties for private consumption at the egregious rates that they're building them at, because you and I need them and the sector needs them to be built. Unless someone starts to pay us enough, or the government starts to pay us enough for us to continue to upgrade and keep pace with the needs of the residents within our old buildings, right? There's only two choices. You either have brand new stuff coming online faster, or you provide enough income for the smaller, medium-sized provider to continue to upgrade the properties they've got. So, and that's why I always say, there's room for everybody in this market. And I'd like to remind everybody that's listening, 80% of the provision is still done by the micro and small provider, never mind the regional provider, which is the medium-sized provider. It's the micro people that own just one facility or one domiciliary care office. That's the majority of the provision. So the analogy to the local high street and the corner shop is a very, very valid one. To the local post office is also a very valid one, particularly given the noises I'm hearing from some of the small providers who are seriously under threat. Their businesses may get shut after this proposed budget. A whole bunch of people have left the sector since the last budget and the raid from the Treasury on, employers' national insurance. And so I think there's a real fear now in the sector, particularly around the micro and small provider, where the incentives to be more innovative, but to capitalize on the incentives to be more innovative is not within their remit anymore, because it does cost some money to acquire new technology. Then it costs some money to implement that technology. And even that's proving hard for smaller care providers to do. And then, on top of that, you have this continuous need to upgrade the properties that they're using to provide the service.
Yeah. So we've mentioned them a lot, and Barchester have been in the news recently because they've just been bought out by Welltower, a US property fund. So for those listening who aren't aware of the deal, Welltower bought out the properties of Barchester for £5.2 billion, and they also bought out the properties of HC1 for £1.2 billion. So a total £6.4 billion. It makes it one of, if not the largest ever, social care investments in Europe, which in and of itself is remarkable. It's a huge statement of intent from Welltower, who have invested previously in the UK, and they do have a very significant US healthcare investment arm, and also in Europe as well. This, for me, I've got my own personal views on this transaction. I'd be really interested to hear your views, Harris, on what you think about the transaction in total, what you think it does for the sector, what you think about the pricing of that, and importantly, what impact do you think that this transaction actually has on individuals who are researching care? So imagine you're looking at a Barchester home or an HC1 home. Does this make a difference for you?
So let's take the macro first. I think it's really good that there is a deep interest in the UK social care, adult social care space. I think it's important for all of the reasons I've just outlined. We need people with deeper pockets to come in, make the investments, because there is a trickle-down effect of all of these things ultimately. And it may not be as direct from, the large business to the carer on the floor, but it is definitely going to be something that trickles down to the regional and then the small and medium-sized provider, where we do tend to pass on a lot more to our staff. I think that, the transaction actually also includes an element of operating capabilities. So, because Welltower is a US listed REIT, they can actually take stakes in the operating business, which is what they've done here. And so what management at Barchester are now left with is a management contract on those homes. I think what will be interesting to see is how that plays out, that new relationship plays out over the next 5 or 10 years. Welltower has, as you rightly pointed out, already invested in the UK for a number of years, and actually works with smaller operators on their roster. And so I imagine a very interesting outcome could be that some of the homes that have been acquired in this transaction that are now being managed by the previous owners, i.e. the Barchester or the HC1 management team, may end up finding themselves under new management contracts with smaller operators. And that's a really interesting mind shift / energy shift that I'm looking out for, because I think that there's a big difference between owner operator led businesses, particularly in our sector, versus purely management led enterprises. And some of that can become very clear in these agreements. So real estate investors, I really like them. And so we must differentiate between a REIT investing versus a private equity fund investing. A REIT is very, very keen to ensure sustainability, because they don't really look to divest of themselves of properties unless they're vastly underperforming, which tends to happen a lot less than in private equity businesses, where they've taken whole ownership of the opco and propco. And so a REIT will always look to change management so that they can continue to have ownership of the actual building. And it's not that easy to convert a building that has been built or purpose built for being a care home into much else. And so, from a long-term sustainability perspective, I view this as a very positive thing. It's, what is your time horizon? So mine is 40 years. And so these guys have enough funds to continue to invest in these properties and continue to ensure that they're going to be sustainable and usable, so that when we come up to that need for 140,000 additional beds, we aren't also losing some of these properties because they're becoming defunct or they've not been run very well or whatever. A real estate investment trust is loath to change management, but is also at the same time very, very focused on local view of that management team. So for each location, they're interested in how that site is viewed by the people that use it. And that's crucial for them.
Yeah.
Because once that changes, it takes a long time and, frankly, entirely new management team to turn it around. And so for them, that's crucial, because you can't just take a building and go somewhere else and start doing the same business somewhere else, right? You have to make that building work.
Yeah, and it's very much like any other landlord-tenant relationship. If the tenant, if you're running a local restaurant or even a local TK Maxx or any local shop, if the tenant isn't doing well, as the landlord, you're going to see lower footfall. If you happen to have a multi-site sort of shopping centre, and your anchor tenant is not doing well, footfall for everyone else is going to fall, which impairs your investment. So, it's the same concept. It's just good investment management of your tenants and your asset mix. But it seems,
and that's why but I'm very keen on the real estate aspect of care being looked at differently than the operating aspect of care. I think historically, we've always had them together, but the care aspect is becoming more and more challenging, and it's highly unlikely that it's going to become easier. I think that trajectory is one way only. It is going to become more and more and more challenging, and I think that ultimately the expectation from our sector, as the demographic shift continues, is that we are going to become even more specialized in the type of care we're providing, because the NHS isn't going to get any bigger. As far as I can tell, they've actually lost 20,000 beds in the last 15 years. So, that's an entirely different debate. But the need of our residents is going to become more complex as time passes. On top of that, we're going to have more aging within a living population, meaning we will live longer and longer and longer. And so the provision that we've got requires specialist real estate investors, because one person cannot do it all. And the cost of the capital required to build new buildings is frankly beyond the reach of most new entrants to the market anyway. But even buying an older building now and setting yourself up in there as a care provider is egregiously expensive. And so what I'm actually worried about is there are a lot of small and micro care providers who will be looking to exit the market. The successful ones will want to do it because they're retiring. The unsuccessful ones are exiting the market anyway already. And if we don't build a sustainable sector, who's going to buy this stuff? Because you and I will also have to retire at some point. And, the assumption that our children are going to take over, particularly with the new IHT rules, I think it's a very bold one. And I'm not willing to make that assumption. I want us to create an environment where people who are passionate about care don't currently involve themselves in it, but are going to be passionate about it, like me. I came from a completely different background. You came from a different background. I think, we need to create a path for these people. But if, a 30-bedded care home in 10 years' time is going to cost them £8 million, well, I don't see them coming into the business. And so we lose out on a potentially good care operator because they can't afford the building.
So from a sustainability point, you see the real estate investment trust buying the property and taking a large amount of the value, if you will, out of the current sort of care structure. You seem to be a bit
but
more...
Can I create a parallel here? This already happened in the education sector, right? We have loads of nurseries, loads of schools, even private ones, where they don't own the building. It's a lease, it's tenanted, 25-year lease, and the quality of the service is phenomenal. And the value is, in fact, also in the OpCo now. It's just a matter of getting started in this now, right? And that's why I see these guys entering into the market.
Yep, okay. So, but it sounded like you were a lot more negative around private equity.
I think I'm not negative around private equity. I think private equity, done right, has enabled so many businesses to scale up and become really very important players from a GDP perspective for our country. So I definitely do not decry private equity investment. I think it's really kind of down to what type of investment. And so as a avowed capitalist, I am against anyone or anything that is going to end up reflecting poorly on the sector at large. And I think that sometimes there is some practices can be quite aggressive that are undertaken by some private equity players. Not all of them actually do investments using the same investment philosophy. And so that's crucial. There are loads of private equity players that have been active in the care sector for 20 years and have done multiple deals, entered, exited again. And those players should be encouraged to carry on.
Okay.
It comes down to something that, you touched on earlier. The view that private equity is purely a financial play, that is the one that has found its feet in actuality now. Because a lot of the very, very large players that eventually folded were because they were highly levered. And they weren't just levered on the operational level, they were levered on, OpCo level, PropCo level, and TopCo level. And that's a shockingly high amount of leverage. There are still players in the private equity market, the mid-market funds, for example, who have a lot of in-house operational capability. And so you have people who have developed a business and are very astute, but need help. And it's that partnership when, somebody turns up at your doorstep, they've got cash to give you, but also experience. That's a beautiful combination. Well, I would do that myself. all day, every day. But just taking cash from an individual when there's no additional expertise that they can provide to help you govern your business better, or to scale up and give you ideas or teach you how to do things better than you're already doing, then why them then? Why not just the bank? Do you know what I mean? It just doesn't feel appropriate. So I would separate the financial wizardry from actual operational, people who will get their hands dirty with you and work through cycles with you. Those are the types of guys that, certainly exist. Those are the value players, right?
So it raises an interesting question. There's very much and I'll use the word moral basis to what you've just said. We talk, care is of course based on values. And
yeah,
I think what you're talking about there is you're looking for an investor whose values align with your own and that you can support each other. And it's a partnership of two organizations working together towards that common goal. And in many ways, actually, a REIT will do exactly the same thing if you're just looking almost at the larger value piece of sustainability. It's interesting that maybe my background in other businesses is perhaps it's a lot less than it has been in social care, but I've not really seen that formal value-based partnership approach in other sectors. But it's absolutely at the core of social care, and it almost means that we always have to operate on a different economic model because we're not profit focused. We're values and outcomes focused. We run our mantra is we run a care home business. That order of priority: get the care right, get the property right, the business follows. And I think a lot of other providers run on very similar ethics and values and what have you. Do you think that we have a problem as a sector then, that our values get in the way of capitalism?
No. I think capitalism is much maligned. That's for sure. I think a lot of snake oil salesmen have decided that they're capitalists now and have entered the foray. There's a lot of marketing behind them. And so young people look at someone who is effectively a gambler, but, has a nice suit and a nice tie and has, 2 million, 5 million, whatever it is, Instagram followers. And then all of a sudden they're an expert. But, we touched on this a long time ago, but the father of modern capitalism, let's call it, was Adam Smith. And everybody, wants to talk about The Wealth of Nations, which was his very famous works. But actually, before he wrote that, he wrote another book, and it was called The Theory of Moral Sentiment. But nobody knows that. You can't really talk about a enterprise, which is effectively a partnership between capital and labor to produce a product, without having some sort of codification of how those two ingredients are going to be combined. It's nonsensical. You can't create water without 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen. If you flip it around, it's something, but it ain't water. So, do you know what I mean? I think profit is not a bad word. Supernormal profits, or undertaking exercises that give you an outsized chunk of the profit, those are bad things, There's always going to be bad faith actors in every sector. And so ours is no different. We're talking about the large players that come in and maybe their morals aren't right. And so, all of us, when we build our businesses, we're always, doing things from the right perspective, and we have the right, morals guiding us. But there are so many small providers who also cut so many corners. And there's a degree of personal responsibility that comes with running a care business. It doesn't matter if you're a large player or a small player. That just comes down to the individuals that are participating in that enterprise, in my opinion. So how you counter that in all ends of the spectrum, or both ends of the spectrum rather, is by having good values. And those values have to permeate the entire organization. Slightly harder to do when you have 8 or 10,000 people, but certainly doable. I mean, somebody created Apple, right? They all sing from the same hymn sheet, or did anyway. And so, you know, I don't really want to take the moral higher ground. I don't want it to sound like I'm better at it than everybody else because, I don't know, I'm a better human being. I don't know if that's true. So the goal of every enterprise has to be focus on the customer, focus on the customer need, which is what you just talked about, right? Care, home, business. That's how we do it as well. I talk about customer journey, right? What is the resident's journey when they're in your home? When do they first interact with you? When do they last interact with you? All of those interactions are at the top of your list. This is what I tell our management team. This is what I tell the staff on the floor, everybody. That is the goal. Once you have made them happy and provided them the service for which you are charging, everything else will fall into place. Just focus on that. And that's kind of the mantra. I mean, I didn't come up with any of this stuff, by the way. I mean, I read books from very well-known, some very publicly derided capitalists. Henry Ford was one of the first people that started paying people with disabilities the same wage as the average worker on the floor in his car shop. That's not something that you would ascribe to a quote-unquote capitalist today, unless there is actual laws that force it to happen, right? But he did it without the laws being present. He's the one that came up with it, and then it got adopted by the government. And it should be happening everywhere, right? So that's why the small provider is so important. That's why it's so important to listen to. And by the way, all of this stuff was done well before Ford became Ford. He had a dogmatic approach to making cars much more available to the public at large, whereas the other providers, and there were already people who were making road cars from carriages, who didn't want that. It was a luxury item. They didn't want it to be produced en masse, so they took him to court. The Automobile Association actually took him to court 3 years into his production opening, where he'd invested all of his money, his uncle, his cousin, whoever he could find, took everybody's money, put it into this thing saying, you know, this is going to be a game changer for the country and then the world. He was already being sued. And by the very people who were there to support the industry. The trade association, Automobile Trade Association of America, sued him. And he took him on. And he won. And it's because of him that we all drive cars. Otherwise, it would have been the same people who rode horse carriages who would have cars. That was the idea. That was the marketing, actually, for American manufacturers and British manufacturers. It is, you used to have, 4 horses or 2 horses with your carriage and your coachman. Now have this.
Yeah.
And it was priced in the same way. So coming back to the concept of capital and labor, all enterprise relies on a combination of these two things. And profitability is an outcome of an endeavor. The endeavor cannot be profit. When the endeavor becomes just profit, that's when you have to start worrying about moral code. So the question must always be, why are you doing what you are doing? If it is just to make a profit, none of those businesses really work or survive. You can have somebody who gains short term, and this is why I mentioned marketing early on, because what we're teaching our young people is that becoming a billionaire overnight is the right approach. It's not.
I suppose my My concern of where the sector could be going, particularly the Welltower investment is interesting because, as you said, it provides a very large capital pot and potential further investment for further growth of the number of properties we have in the UK. As you said, it's critical that we do have more care facilities, more care beds for a wide number of reasons. Mm-hmm. My concern is around the pricing of the deal and quite how much Welltower have spent, and in order for them to get their return for their investors. Ultimately, there has to be a cash flow from the UK care operations, which will largely be privately funded because it's Barchester and HC1, and they are largely privately funded organisations. They'll be taking that money and it will be going offshore, literally to the United States. At a point, Barchester and HC1's operations, and now their objective is, it's not so much profit, but paying rent to a third-party landlord. My concern is that if we go down the route of having properties owned by third parties, and we do have this property company and operating company separation, which for a sustainability point, I completely understand why you'd want to have that. My concern is that paying your landlord rent becomes the objective of these care providers, not care. Because we saw what happened with Four Seasons, we saw what has happened with Southern Cross. As the rent goes up, that just becomes this all-consuming issue. Do you have that fear, or do you think that actually the sector has learned from those past issues?
No, I don't have that fear at all. I don't think that's what happened in Four Seasons. Four Seasons was it was a tri-co structure, so there were 3 entities, and all of them were relying on the same source of revenue, which was the resident. And all 3 of them were levered separately, but there was no look-through on that for total debt to earnings capability, right, or net debt to EBITDA. And so it was way too high. And so that introduces an element of risk into the enterprise that is frankly unnecessary. And so this is different because of what I had said earlier. I mean, Welltower will not want their tenants to be focused entirely on paying rent, because if they make it impossible for people to service the rent payments, they will not have a tenant. And that will then obviously negate the entire investment thesis of buying these properties. So I don't think that, they would look at it from the perspective of, okay, let's race to the bottom, because that's what would happen, right? The local authorities have done that. They've taken their vast scale and they've said, we are going to get the cheapest service possible, not the appropriate service, but the cheapest service possible. And we're going to keep doing that because we can. And so what they're ending up with is a situation where you now have care deserts. No new providers are going to the north of this country. No new providers are building care homes in the north of this country. And if you read some of the reports that are coming out, it's very obvious that when we have that increase in care needs, a lot of it is actually going to be in the north, where there's not going to be any provision. And so, if we are going to talk about funds going offshore and being concerned at that depth about British PLC, then we have to also counterbalance it with what our own government is doing to the sector. So, of course, I would want to keep all of the tax here. And, I literally had to take my car to the garage because I went into a giant pothole the other day. And, this is the capital of what was once the capital of Europe that I'm driving around in. And the potholes are the size of frickin' black holes, some of them. So I would want all of those fixed. And I know that tax is needed for that. And some of the schooling could benefit from the taxes and what have you. But at the same time, I can't really punch a gift horse in the mouth, I'm afraid. So, if somebody's doing this transaction, coming in, investing their money, and this is a long-term investor, by virtue of being a landlord, They're a long-term investor.
Right.
They're not in it on a 5-year cycle or a 10-year cycle. They don't have cycles.
Yeah, no,
it's a publicly listed entity. All of them are publicly listed. Their job is to provide long-term sustainable returns to their shareholders.
Yep.
So they will just keep buying. And so they want a relationship with their tenants, which is going to last a long time. If their tenants do things that is going to, impact the reputation of any one of those locations, those tenants are going to be in trouble in those locations, and they will find a better tenant. In our sector, a better tenant is not one that charges a lot of money for the provision of care. A better tenant is almost always, the tenant that provides the best service. And that could be you or me, right? And that's where everything has pros and cons, but for me, this is mostly going to be net positive.
I wanted to pick up something you said. We obviously very briefly skirted over Adam Smith, but you've also spoken about the lack of investment in social care in the north of England, and the fact that no one's building new care homes up there. The fee rates, frankly, north of Birmingham are quite scary. I wouldn't say that we have a successful national market in social care. I'd argue actually that this fragmentation that we have of care, and if you're in the southeast, you probably have more care accessible to you than you do if you live in Cornwall or if you live in the north of England.
Yeah,
we
agreed.
seem to be lurching towards a potentially failed market. And I'd argue from a pure Adam Smith perspective that we've got heavy regulation, you've got the moral duty that you spoke about, and we've got government funding, all three of which sort of mean that we don't have a market that is free to operate as it wants to. Do you think that we actually have that problem in the UK, or am I overreading this?
No, to a certain extent. We've got huge government overreach, and without what seems to me to be any sensible checks or balances. There's a lot of doubling up of plans, activities that could all be centralized and done at a national level. And so I've always been an advocate for nationally funded social care. You shared the statistics about how many people pass away because of dementia, and for it to be treated as a social issue is actually insulting, frankly. And so, why is it any different from cancer? I'll tell you why. A cynical part of me says because it only affects old people. No one cares about them. And so, that has to change. And I think coming back to the Adam Smith point, I think that the more regulation you add to the market, the more hurdles you create in new people becoming interested in a sector that is only going to grow, are actually just massive. It's cutting off your nose to spite your own face, basically. I think it's just very, very silly and short-termist. And I think that the market is going to fail. It hasn't yet, but it is certainly entering that, because even in the last 7 years that I've been an observer and then an operator, I have seen a lot of very small businesses become unable to operate because they are not paid the fair cost of care. There's no money left behind for reinvesting in their service. There is no money left behind for them to take anything more than just a salary. And that is a huge failing of capitalism, right? When you are basically taking all of the risk, but your return is not on the risk-reward curve. Why are you taking the risk then? And so then people stop taking risk. When people stop taking risk, what do they become? Dependent on employers or on the state. And once the employers start to dry up, it is just the state. And so I think that every good government should understand that they have to find the balance between particularly in a social democracy, they have to find a balance between that mix of capital and labor. And then the extragenous factors are always tax, regulation, which are government controlled, fiscal policy. And I think that, this is what I speak of when I say government overreach. Regulation has started from a good place, but the implementation of it has been an absolute nightmare. I hope you appreciate, by the way, Michael, because we know each other, how hard I am working not to swear. I don't think you've appreciated that. I've kept very good control of my mouth.
Wasn't going to say anything, and when this goes on to YouTube, you're not demonetizing it, so I'm loving it, frankly.
Okay, yeah, exactly. So anything for those clicks, Mike. And so I find it very challenging, this environment where government has certainly overstepped its, in its role. I worry that this continuous ignoring and kicking the can down the line strategy will end up taking us to a point where there will only be big providers that have survived. And, short term, and for me, short term is 10 years, they will have gained lots of new clientele because all the small providers are gone and, unable to operate. The margins will have shrunk, but currently they're 30, so they're down to 20. It's still very good because they've taken on all these new clients and whatnot. And then some big scandal will happen, and in a minute, it'll become nationalized. And that's going to be the end, frankly. I don't think people understand the scale of social care versus NHS. I mean, imagine the amount of, it's 4 times the size, right? At a minimum, not 4 times, 8 times the size. Mm-hmm. It's 8 times the size if you only look at provision per bed and then you include dom care in that. Yeah. We're looking after 1.3, 1.4 million people. Mm-hmm. And they have 108,000 beds. Mm. And then obviously some community provision on top. But it's not on the same scale. They don't have the infrastructure. You can't even build that infrastructure, frankly. It would take decades. But that's what I worry about, that some crazed lunatic is going to come into power. There's going to be, a massive disaster. There's only 35 providers in the whole country. Somebody says this is a oligopoly, and boom, nationalized. That's why I keep using the word sustainable sector, because you cannot have a sustainable sector if you don't have all shades and colors providing the service. The small provider shouldn't bemoan the very large one, and the very large one shouldn't sit there, counting their stacks of cash and saying, "Oh, just wait till these guys go up in flames," because they're next. It's always that, right? It's, if you don't support the smaller player, you're next. Because you're not making any noise, and the government just keeps doing what they're doing, and slowly it ebbs away at the actual marketplace, and you end up with a mess. And so when we talk about a fully functional operational free market, in a free market you are supposed to have failures. In a free market you are supposed to have capacity to endure those. You're supposed to have good agents and bad agents, because that's a reflection. A free market is basically a reflection of society. And so, you can't have an entirely purified society. That's not how society works. And so to me, having the ability to ride out the scandals that will happen can only happen when we also have a very fair dissemination of information. So the work that you and I are doing, and others like us, which is the vast majority of care in this country, that never makes it to BBC. That never makes it to ITV. That never makes it to Sky. It's never in the press. No one talks about it. The only thing people are interested in talking about is a scandal. And that's actually the real moral decay that we have to worry about, frankly, societal one. because that is what drives what you were talking about, which happens in, oh, can we trust this man or this lady or that lady who runs this fund, or, where does it all come from? It's all just a reflection of what we practice in our own lives every day. And so the issue actually is we have policy and big government that doesn't understand the sector, is not interested in understanding the sector, because it is not a political soundbite. They only want to focus on political sound bites because they all also have benefactors that want them to succeed and win elections and whatnot, right? So most of their goals are now misaligned with the people that they are responsible for and responsible to. So that's actually a much bleaker picture than just worrying about the social care sector. I think our solution is very easy. Our solution is, let's focus on building something that is sustainable. To do that, we need to have enough money being paid to the provider directly, rather than 500 middlemen who take 5% of what you sent for social care, right? So now that's your local authorities and the hundreds. So what is it? 132 or 34 unitary authorities that pay for social care. And so every one of them has their own commissioning team, right? Why do you need so many? And then they come up with their own pricing. And 5 miles apart, 2 care homes being paid for the same service, £300 difference. None of that makes any sense, right? And most people understand that it doesn't make sense, but they don't want to change it because it's like, why does it matter? It's about old people. Like, why do we care? But that's the problem. It is going to impact all of us at some point in our lives. And it is, in fact, inescapable. And so to pretend that it is not something that should be talked about at the doorstep by politicians when they're, out there trying to get votes is silly. And so some of it is sector responsibility, but some of it is just general societal responsibility. People have to start talking about this, and it can't just be us. It has to be everybody.
So the joys of having a teenage son, he's doing GCSE history at the moment and is studying Elizabeth I. Turns out in 1601, Elizabeth I implemented the Poor Law, which was the first real sort of evidence of a sort of a social welfare state. It involved hyper-localized parishes raising a little bit of cash to pay for the deserving poor or those who couldn't look after themselves and what have you. This rolls through into the amended Poor Law in the 1830s, which much more Victorian era, personal moral responsibility. And that doesn't change really. And well, there's some amendments in the 1920s, basically because there was this concept of the workhouse, and the workhouse was meant to be worse than if you were a labourer and living in that, because you weren't meant to like being in a workhouse. And you go through to the National Assistance Act of the 1940s and the creation of the NHS and all of that. So hey, GCSE history teaches you something, right? Amazing. But it's seeing this process of how we've gone from this Elizabethan concept of collective responsibility, and that has been maintained through to the NHS for health, but on the concept of housing, which older person social care, which we both live and breathe, that has always been a local authority, local parish issue. And it's still, for me, it's still got this moral responsibility behind it. Oh, you can't afford to look after yourself. You've got to rely on the state. You have almost failed morally. That changed with the Care Act in 2014, but I don't think we've had the national conversation of here is the expectation nationally around collective responsibility. We all pay our taxes to support the collective, but if 1 in 3 of us is going to have some access and some touch points with social care in our life, and as we grow older and our population ages, we're almost definitely going to have some touch points with it. What was in the 1940s a service for the minority We lived until we were 65, maybe 70 then. Now we're living 85, even 90 on average in certain parts of the UK.
Yeah.
So we now have a service for the majority. I think this talks to your point about the national conversation. Where are we? Over 450 odd years later, 425 years later, we still haven't had the conversation around how this collective responsibility works.
Yeah, I think that's very, very valid and very appropriate to bring up. This concept of collective responsibility, but there's also a concept of personal responsibility. Both of those have eroded, not just one. And I think the challenge now is the societal conversations that need to be had are about our labor productivity, about what young people are doing, about how we're going to look after an ever-increasing, ever-aging population, and just generally focusing on the standard of living for everybody. Because I view everything from a customer journey perspective, and I think that this is our journey, yours and mine. What are we doing with our lives? And in that, of course, the state has some responsibility, which is how I would define collective responsibility. But I have personal responsibility also, right? And I think that has shrunk a lot more in the last 15 or 20 years. At least that's my feeling. Then the burden on the state just keeps increasing and increasing and increasing. Now, some of it can't be helped because there are people who, like you said, will live a lot longer and effectively become a burden on the state. But that means that the rest of us have to look at ourselves and say, am I doing enough? A, so that I don't become part of that. But B, for the people that are already in that situation, am I doing enough? And I think that that's the bit that somehow, it's become lost, actually. In public discourse now, I don't really see a lot of, here's my personal responsibility. I'm getting a wage. That means I must do this, 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 and this. And so we have these conversations, every once in a while about work from home, for example. Productivity went up for a lot of employees when work from home was first introduced. But I would argue that those people were in fact already highly productive and incredibly good at being self-starters. I don't mind admitting that my productivity actually went down because I operate a lot better in a busy environment where I have like-minded people around me and I feed off that energy and it motivates me to do more. And so what that whole episode taught me is that in fact, there's lots of untapped potential for more productivity. But then there's a real risk of a massive drop-off in productivity. And it really comes down to the individual. Because some individuals have very strong, I won't call it moral compass, but they're just very conscientious. And they have the capability to organize themselves in ways that other people can't. And so, in fact, I would argue that those are very special people that can actually produce more by not being part of the melee, whereas others actually need to be part of it to produce their best work. And so we have to now live in a world where we have to find that balance, right? And I think that that's what people find really jarring, is to try and negotiate and find a balance that works. Because you've either got the brigade that says everybody's going back to work 5 days a week, and if you don't, then you're fired. Or you've got the people that say, well, I'm not going to take a job if you make me come to work every day because I can't afford X, Y, and Z and blah, 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 blah. And so, how are we going to make society function if people stop going to work or if people stop working, right? And so it is imperative not to just identify the problems, but actually come up with some solutions that are practical and will work. So I tell you what I do. I actually ask people in my team who, and you know, it's a much smaller business. Some of the functions in our business, they're impossible to do from home, but some can be done from home. And so the functions that can be done from home, we have a practical conversation. Simple as that. You know, you need to be in on X, Y, and Z days because there is something to be said of team building. There is something to be said of face-to-face meetings, developing human relationships rather than through a screen, etc., etc., etc. Right? But we don't have a dogmatic approach to being at work. I come to work almost every day because I actually need that. I need to wake up. I cannot operate properly if I don't have a schedule, if I don't follow the same routine every day. But lots of people don't need that structure. And so those are the ones that I say, okay, well, you know, if we can see that somebody's a self-starter, they don't need to be chased for things. If you basically give them something to do and then you never have to follow up, they come to you. If there's a problem, they come to you. When it's finished, they come to you. Do you know, if somebody can do that, they can work from Mars for all I care. And I really don't care. They can work from wherever they want. But I don't know what your opinion is, but I don't have a lot of those people. There are few and far between that can do that. And so, you know, you can't start a conversation and then just say, okay, well, it's either this or that. It can't be a combination. And if it's a combination, it has to apply for everybody in exactly the same way. It's just, then there's no point in those conversations. And I think that applies to most things. I've actually forgotten your question.
It was.
I went off on one.
It was around the economic sort of. I guess the economic efficiency of this change between collective responsibility and personal responsibility.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so not too far off topic, but I think, you know, ultimately, all commerce, all enterprise, all of it depends on a combination of labor and labor and capital, or skill and capital, however you want to put it. And, you know, you can optimize capital to a certain degree, but at one point it just becomes financial engineering, which is what I would describe having 3 entities that rely on the same source of revenue to have 5 different types of funding. Labor, as we progress technologically more and more with each passing decade, it is harder to increase. So the gains that you get, the marginal utility from technologizing, will become smaller and smaller, I think, as it has done. So the big jump in productivity didn't happen in the last 10 years or 15 years or 20 years with the advent of the internet. It was huge, but it was not as big as the changes that happened when we had the Industrial Revolution, or things like when, I'll go back to this guy, but there were others, you know, when Henry Ford had the idea of putting the production line on rails. So the person stands still, the parts move, right? And then he is the one that, as far as I know, he said, well, actually, on the floor is not great because people have to bend down. Why don't you just take this and stick it in the ceiling? And that's even better, right? He came up with it. And so that is game-changing en masse, right? And that's part of the thing that I struggle with AI, at least in my own usage. Yes, you can save a lot of time. And a lot of individual time is being saved by summarizing documents and, you know, but you still have to read them. And the problem that I've got now is that I can see emails that are sent to me by an individual who was sending me emails 2 years ago, and now the email reads completely differently. It's like he's got a lawyer sat on his shoulder and a copywriter on the other one, and they're pristine. But then I write something back and the response is almost as if he's not read it.
Yeah.
And so that's a big concern in this chase for productivity. We may end up introducing some very negative habits, i.e., cognitive decline. But that's a separate topic. So yeah, personal responsibility is crucial before you talk about community responsibility. I think the advent of some of the things that you talked about in history were essential, right? Because back then, in the 1600s, there was no health service. I don't even think there were any. I mean, there were no hospitals, and so people were dying at a very, very young age. A lot of people were dying because they just didn't have enough food. And then, you had all these cholera, dysentery, all these types of diseases that would not bother anyone today. And so that's great advancement that we live longer. But the challenge is, as we have lived longer, we have shared the element of personal responsibility. So back then who was it that started it? I forget. Was it Victoria?
No, Queen Elizabeth, 1601.
Elizabeth, yeah. Elizabeth the First. Yeah. Elizabeth the First, right? In her time, there was never any collective responsibility. Humans were traded like goods. So that context is very, very important when discussing collective responsibility today. The state had no responsibility towards you. In fact, your king was a baron, effectively, and you paid taxes directly into his coffers. Not the treasury was his personal treasury, not one for the benefit of every countryman. So it was vastly different. And in that time, introducing something that looks after the people is very different than introducing it now, where the state is paying, I don't know, 220 billion pounds every year in benefits. It's dramatically different. But that element of personal responsibility back then was, I must get up. It doesn't matter if I've got cholera. I will still have to go to work, because if I don't, I will die. And then once I'm dead, my children will all die. That doesn't happen now, right? So the graph is sort of changed. It's, you have, government responsibility or collective responsibility doing this, and you've got personal responsibility doing that. And that's a big problem now, because, you and I could argue this. Part of that 220 billion that's being spent on benefits, how much of it is actually being spent correctly? How much of it is subject to fraud? How much of it could our sector have, so that we can stop these small and micro enterprises from failing? That's what concerns me. All that cash that could come in here and support these businesses that are providing effectively a vital service. We argue it from so many different ways, and it almost always all falls on deaf ears, which is so, I suppose, demoralizing and uninspiring. But argue we must, because I now view it as sectoral personal responsibility, actually. We have to leave the sector better than we found it, all of us, because I'm not going to be around when the requirement is going to be 200,000 bed shortfall, and neither are you. But we will have spent a couple of decades, maybe more, in the sector, and if we're just going to come in, buy 10, flip them, exit, and say sayonara, done nothing to make things better, then what was the point? I don't see the point. So it has to be sustainable, not just for the residents that we have today, but the residents of the future.
Yeah, exactly. I'm aware that we've been going for about an hour and a half, and I just wanted to sort of bring this back to where we started, almost, sort of the question of what question do what do we wish people knew more about. The purpose of this podcast is to support people as they make their journey into social care from a wide variety of sources. We've gone through an awful lot of quite deep economic policy here and sort of societal stuff, which is it's really, for me, it's really important to understand that so you understand the decisions and the framework that providers are making. If you understand how our businesses think and operate at a base level, you can start to understand some of the operational decisions. Imagine you're talking to people who are looking for care, either for themselves or for their loved ones. What do you think, from a pure play economic perspective, given what we've discussed, what should they respond to, and what questions should they be asking their provider?
I think from an economic perspective, it starts with the personal. So how does it impact them? So funding then becomes crucial to understand properly. We have so many layers of funding. We've got ICB funding, FNC funding, local authority funding, top-ups, and private funding. And then we have so many different conditions that we deal with, which then add additional complexity to how the funding will work. Whether you can stay at home, whether at what point, how is the decision made that you can no longer stay at home, who is going to support you in the community, how does that get funded, etc., etc., etc. I think that the funding at a macro level can be simplified and should be, and we touched on this. Dementia doesn't belong at a local level funding. It's certainly something that should be funded nationally. That would simplify a lot of this. And then, a lot of people actually give up their jobs and their careers to stay at home and look after their family members. And we haven't touched on this, but there are loads of people who act as personal carers. And then there's the personal care allowance and so on and so forth. So there's so many different elements. And what the government has to do is try and simplify those things so they are bite-sized and available to people, at least as they approach their entry into this very complex world. I think that in some parts of the country, the combination of the multidisciplinary teams works really, really well. And in other parts of the country, and I can say this because I'm in 4 different local authorities. So, I have experienced vastly different multidisciplinary teams. And, that could work a lot better from the point of view of a family that is having to deal with something like this. And so the education piece is crucial. Build people's knowledge before they get to the inevitable, frankly, is important. And we need certainly a lot more conversation about dementia as a whole. I don't think that's enough. What we do right now is not enough. And I think that, when somebody turns up, the questions that they usually ask are a little bit confused. They'll ask questions about funding and sometimes also about how the condition progresses and deteriorates. And of course, we have lots of knowledge because we've looked after people, for decades already. But why is the GP not giving a more wholesome picture, right? Why don't we have geriatric care available at a GP level, right? We don't have geriatric specialists. And, it's this type of long-term thinking that is required for this sector that is only going to become more and more important, not just socially, but also economically. And we've talked about this in the beginning. It's already 77 billion, right? And it's just going to grow bigger. And so the resources that are required to ensure that the knowledge exists around funding, but also around dementia, I would say, that is crucial. So we need to do more research, then we need to make it bite-sized, understandable, and then available. And we don't need to look far. We've done a great job on cancer. I think there's so much more testing happening, both for men and women. Men arguably need a bit more of a push from what I've heard, but, there is a lot more testing happening. And so we can do the same. We just need to decide to do it. And this is not stuff that costs money. It's just you sit there. And this is you could use AI for, actually. Right? How to disseminate all of this information in a very concise fashion. I would say crucial for anyone that is looking at care provision for a loved one, the two things that you must absolutely try and get your head around is a very good understanding of what is it that your loved one is suffering from, so that you can really understand and ask people what the progression may look like. And then funding, crucial to understand funding. I mean, we explain it obviously when people arrive, but it will be so much better if, we're not diagnosing people. So at the point of diagnosis, enough information should be shared that they're not having to ask again. Or it should be shared in a manner that it sort of settles in their mind. And that makes the decision-making process a lot easier as well.
Exactly. I wish it were the case. We wish there was more understanding out there. But you're absolutely right. It's not there. Harris, you've been awesome. Thank you so much for your time. If people want to find out more about you, is there a sort of a central place where you put most of your stuff, or are you scattered across the internet like most of us?
If people want to get in touch with me, LinkedIn is probably the best way to do it. And then I can answer any questions people have them.
Cool, awesome. And yeah, you do put a lot on there from Providers Unite as well, which is an organisation I know that you're getting increasingly involved with.
Yes, absolutely. And that's the bit about personal responsibility, right? I got tired of complaining about what the government was or wasn't doing. And I thought, okay, it's not changing this way, so I need to do something differently.
It's genuinely interesting to see. And there's something happening. I'd be really interested to see what happens next. Anyway, Harris.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. Thank
so
you for having me.
See you in a bit.
Cheers, Mike. Bye.